cheap damn binoculars, they were clearly distorting my vision. That was the first thought that came to my mind last June when my life as I knew it ended. I'm Daniel to friends Dan Almond. I'm 5'10" tall, weigh 180 pounds, have dark brown hair, and what I've been told are sizzling brown eyes. I work for one of those government agencies that protects your rights and freedoms as an American citizen. Of course, I have no right to say which one. Of course, I could tell you, but in the interests of national security, I would have to kill you. Anyway, I was squatting between two abandoned buildings in a rundown neighborhood in Washington, D.C., watching two people engaged in apparently voluntary adult affairs. Okay, even I'm tired of this official chatter. I watched the girl engaged in sex with a guy through my binoculars and almost lost my self-control. I almost lost it for two reasons. Firstly, because they were my colleagues, supposedly on a mission, and secondly, because the hot girl was my wife. I couldn't stand it anymore, and, seething with anger, I simply left the place. So much for a romantic visit with the love of my life while she was working. I've seen enough to last me a lifetime. Meg, I call this one traitor Meg because that's her damn name, and I both worked in different departments of the same agency. Because of agency rules, we never worked on the same assignment. So while we could check mission logs or boards and see where each of us was and what we were doing, we tried to avoid that because bringing emotion into the field makes you careless. And I have to admit that, until now, seeing Meg in danger would make me pressure her to leave or take a desk job. I think the main difference in this situation between me and the civilian is probably the very few emotions running through my mind. But in terms of my ability to share my feelings and rationally plan my actions, the differences were huge. Also, in terms of my resources and methods of dispensing revenge, the differences had to be measured in light years. I quietly left the place with a face masking a calm that hid all my emotions. Anyone looking at me, with my slightly satisfied expression, would have thought that I was simply lost and looking for my car. In fact, some have come very close to death or serious injury. Meg. I sat back and thought about my husband Dan. This man could drive me crazy just by looking at me a certain way. He was the reason I started doing this whole agency thing. I love my husband much more than he could love me. When I'm in the field, I work as an agent for an unmentionable government agency. It is extremely dangerous to be distracted. The danger around me and my partner is almost palpable. Adrenaline is coursing through my veins, and I know that any moment could be my last. This usually makes me think about what I'll miss the most if I get hurt or killed, and I go crazy thinking about never seeing Dan again. So about a year ago, because I screwed up horribly on a mission, my then partner just dragged me into an abandoned building and asked me, "What the hell is going on?" I explained the situation to him, and we had sex. Then he simply left the building and went back to work. I did the rest of the task well, and when I got home, I pounced on Dan, and we made love. He liked it, and so did I. Of course, I didn't tell him what led to this performance. I just told him the parts about adrenaline and stress at work. A few months later, Jose, my partner, applied for a transfer, and I was assigned another partner. I didn't want to disrupt the mix, so I went to him to get what I needed. Plus, it's an unspoken law in intelligence and law enforcement that what happens on a mission stays on a mission. I was sure Dan would understand this. When we were doing this again on a mission, friend, in the back of my mind, I felt something was wrong. "What's happened?" Ray asked, jumping up. "The damn car is gone," I said, realizing we were in deep trouble. How could we explain that the suspect we were supposed to be following just got up, walked out to his car, and drove away while we were at work? We should have at least called in a mobile unit to continue surveillance from the road. "Stupid bitch, you should have been keeping an eye on him," Ray snapped. "If we do get out of this, I'll change partners," he growled. Ray pulled out his cell phone and called the mobile unit. He told them that the car had just left, so with any luck, the mobile unit would be blamed for not finding them in time. Ray and I silently gathered our equipment, returned to the car, and drove to the base. We didn't say a word to each other the whole way. When I went down to the underground parking lot to pick up my personal car for the ride home, I found Ray waiting for me. You know, Meg, before we started working together, I felt great at my job, Ray said. Now I feel like crap all the time, he continued. When it comes to sex, I have to admit that I'm weak, he said. I heard rumors about you before we were assigned to work together, but that wasn't my problem, he said. Then we met and I found out it was true, he continued. At first I thought it was great, he said, smiling. But every time I see Dan, he's a great guy, someone you want to have your back with, he continued. Every time I see him, I feel like crap, like I betrayed his trust, he said. I feel like I should just tell him he's married to a damn prostitute and ask for forgiveness, he said. So when this task is over, we'll be done, he said seriously. I cannot allow a repeat of today's failure to jeopardize the security of my country, my marriage, my career, or my future life, he said and walked away without allowing me to answer. I got into the car and drove home. The house was dark and quiet. I turned off the security system and turned it back on in the kitchen. Dan didn't cook dinner, so he must have been very tired when he came home. He probably had an early call to work tomorrow, so he most likely just went to bed. This was unusual because usually, if I was on a mission, Dan was constantly worried about me. He used to call me every hour. When I was working, I would simply turn off the ringer on my phone and his messages, which were usually short messages like, I love you, or just checking in, would go to voicemail. As soon as I finished, I turned on the phone, listened to all his messages, and he could talk to me. Why didn't he call me? I checked my phone and saw that he was calling me almost every hour until 8 p.m. He was probably home and in bed by then for his early morning call to work. Another strange thing was that he didn't wait for me. Usually, if I was out of the house, he would wait for me until I was back and safe. God, I love this man. I went up to our bedroom and turned on the light. Dan was a very light sleeper, so I expected him to wake up, but he didn't. Well, I could talk to him in the morning. I just needed to think about what to tell him and how much. I knew Dan would support me no matter what, so I went to bed. Dan. I heard Meg come in, but I pretended to be asleep. The last thing I wanted was to have sex with her again. I woke up early the next day and went to work. After going through several layers of security required to access our work level, I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down with my department head. What's on our board today, Arnie? I asked. You're still on duty with those arms dealers, he said. Meg is, he began. I interrupted him, interrupting. Arnie, you know that I don't want to know what's going on with her at work. We keep home and work separate, I said. Oh, that's different, he said. She and Ray were not present for more than 8 minutes after their suspect left the premises, he said. The mobile unit they called was already on the only road leading from the suspect's house, and when he didn't show up, they called a helicopter, he continued. We had previously treated the roof of the suspect's car with an invisible reflective polymer, so the helicopter found him almost instantly, but he was at least 5 miles away, he said. So we'll have to ask them how the hell they lost it, he said seriously. Strange things happen in the field, I told him. Yes, I know, that's why we sent 2 agents there for simple observation, he said. So if one of them is busy, the other one picks up what's going on, he continued. Damn, you do the same thing to those gun dealers and you're on your own, but every time the guy moves you're like a stinker on shit after him, he said. There were 2 of them there, and the guy just got in his damn car and drove off, he screamed. Luckily for us, he just went for a ride. What if he washed his damn car and the helicopter couldn't identify him, he asked. After this task, I will have serious questions for your beautiful wife and her partner, he said. But to keep up appearances, I send them back and tell them nothing bad happened, he said. If they screw it up again, though, I'll have to take off my good guy hat and become Dr. Weir's shit, he said seriously. So, I know you keep work and home separate, but tell her to get her pretty head out of her ass. I was assigned to follow an arms dealer from a group that was suspected of purchasing weapons from some contacts in our own army. It wasn't unusual for us to lose a weapon or 2 here or there through damage or other causes, But these guys were responsible for a large number of weapons ending up in the hands of bad guys around the world. As part of what I do, I usually record my observation sessions so that I can later analyze what went wrong if something unpleasant happens. My handlers in the field cannot communicate with me directly. In short, they can hear me talking to them, but I cannot answer them because I cannot hear them. This prevents any accidental transmission on their part that could put me in danger in an undercover situation. If I use certain code words, they know to send reinforcements immediately. I notice that Meg and her partner are once again assigned to watch their suspect starting at 4 p.m. My 8-hour shift started at 2 p.m. I will be released at 10 p.m. They wouldn't finish until 2 a.m., which was perfect for what I had planned. I also had plenty of time to start planning my divorce before going on duty. Being in law enforcement and intelligence was good because I had constant contact with a constant stream of lawyers. I called a friend and asked her to give me a recommendation for the best divorce lawyer she knew. The woman she mentioned was already familiar to me from several cases, but I did not know that she was involved in divorces. Bonnie Coletta, small and spunky, a real tough bitch as a criminal defense lawyer, I hoped she would bring the same spunk and persistence to my divorce. If everything goes according to my plan, I probably won't need much of it, but shit happens. My goal was to gather irrefutable evidence and present it as a threat to both Meg and Ray. Meg will have to give me everything I want in the divorce or risk losing her and Ray's career and his marriage. From my locker, I pulled out my Model 85 sniper rifle in 2038 billet Hardison. I often took this weapon on missions just to be on the safe side. I checked it into the armory because the rules required that all weapons in the field be accounted for. I then also loaded one of the Browning sniper rifles that we confiscated from the criminals on the last mission into the trunk of my car. These weapons were unregistered and were never entered into the agency's logs, so it was practically untraceable. The Browning rifle was the weapon I intended to use. After loading the car while I was out of sight, I returned to my office and began transferring half the money from all of our joint bank accounts to new accounts in my name. I also canceled all credit cards that were on joint accounts. These steps effectively divided our finances, but did so in a way that I felt was fair. Basically, everything that was hers remained hers, everything that was mine remained mine, and everything that was ours was either canceled or divided in half. The only problem was the house, and since she was the one who cheated, I felt entitled to it. There was also the fact that the house was not tainted, since apparently her infidelity did not occur at home. At least she wasn't that stupid. We planned to have children at the end or after the completion of our intelligence careers. Fortunately, we didn't have children yet. This made the whole process easier. I was surprised at how calm I was about the whole situation. Over the years, I've done some downright evil things to help colleagues who were going through divorces. Sometimes it was simple surveillance, in the spirit of catching a spouse cheating with a camera. In other cases, it involved planting evidence to obtain a confession that was then used in court. Both cases involved supporting a colleague for a period of time until he could stand on his own 2 feet again. Meg had to endure some pretty awkward and depressing dinners during those times. Surprisingly, I was very calm about the whole situation, even though I loved her. I knew that everything was over between us. There was no coming back after what I saw. I needed to close this chapter, but not in the same way that a normal person would. I needed Meg to feel the same emotional pain that I felt, and I had a way to do it. Secondly, I needed her to lose something that she values above. All else, just like I lost her. And finally, her partner, a man who betrayed. Not only a fellow agent, but also his wife. His honor and his country. He betrayed everything, so he needed serious losses, and tonight. Meg. I woke up the next morning and reached out to Dan, but found only an empty space. I missed him so much. I was alone in bed, then I remembered that he was sleeping when I arrived. He probably had an early call. While I was tossing and turning last night, I was thinking a lot about my surgery and my life in general. I decided that I needed to curb my desires and actions and take control of my life. Sooner or later, these things always end in disaster, and I have too much to lose. I know this sounds dramatic, but I don't think I could live without Dan. Therefore, when dressing for work, I deliberately wore trousers instead of a skirt. Firstly, they were more practical in case something happened, and secondly, they made it more difficult and less likely for me to do something indecent. As I walked through security, I could feel the guards' eyes on me. It was funny because I had never noticed this before. Have they always looked at my breasts like that? Was it just me or all the female employees and agents? Up ahead, I saw Kelly Tamashita gathering her things and entering the main hall. If I hurry and she waits, I can just slide behind the big metal door before it closes, and I have to wait for it to open again. I was sure she saw me, but as soon as I got to the door, it closed. Bitch, I thought. I could have waited. Kelly and I never got along, and that's putting it mildly. I hated that bitch with all my soul, and I was almost sure that the feeling was mutual. She had long, silky black hair, as expected of an Asian woman, but that's where the stereotypes ended. She had long legs, huge breasts, and a walk that could stop a walk. She was the best linguist on staff and was fluent in several languages, including Spanish, Arabic, and Russian. I headed straight to the Situation Room to see if my husband would be there, but he wasn't. I checked the board and learned that his surgery didn't start until 2 p.m. Why the hell didn't he wait for me? He was probably helping one of his friends who had solved personal problems again. Damn, I missed him so much, and I really needed to talk to him. I called his cell phone, and it rang 3 or 4 times, and then went to voicemail. I ran downstairs to the armory, hoping to catch him while he was loading up on his operation. The guys in the cage told me that he checked his sniper rifle earlier. Where the hell was he? I started thinking about all our plans for the future. We wanted to have kids and buy a bigger house and have jobs to talk about with friends and neighbors. I really wanted to try being a stay-at-home mom and just raising Dan's kids. This could happen sooner than we planned if we don't find a way to get this operation back to normal. We got lucky last night. In all the time I've been doing this, this was the first and only time something went wrong. I chalked it up to simple bad luck. I was already starting to feel a little nervous just thinking about it. Of course, the fact that Dan didn't take care of me last night only added to it. I spent the rest of the time before surgery in my office playing tag with Dan on the phone. He left me a couple of messages, but didn't answer when I called back. The messages were also strange, if you know us. They were very formal and polite. It was as if he was talking to a colleague rather than his wife. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Perhaps the problem that Ray and I narrowly avoided last night had gotten to him. He was friends with the department head, so he may have been trying to distance himself from me at work in case a storm blew up. It wouldn't be good if we both ended up out of work. Of course, he might be mad at me for having to vouch for me to Arnie too. He had to do this once during my probationary period as an agent, and he vowed not to do it again. That's probably what kept Ray and I out of trouble. 4 hours later, Ray and I were back in surgery. We heard from the agents who were on duty before us that our subject, Mr. Kelly Galascos, was sleeping because he was drunk. Meg, I'm sorry about all the crap I said last night, Ray said. I was just pissed that we let this guy get away from us, he continued. So no offense, he asked, holding out his hand. Well, maybe, I said. Listen, Ray, you know how I am, I said. When I'm nervous, I get careless. In our business, carelessness and nervousness can kill us, I continued. But I promise this will be the last time, I said seriously. Not necessarily, Ray said. I told you I was just pissed off last night. Dan. I was on my mission for about 5 hours. It was 7 p.m. and I would be relieved at 10. My arms dealer was unconscious, as usual. I had rented a car previously and my Mustang was parked in its usual spot. I couldn't take it for 2 reasons. Firstly, because if they investigated, they would look at the tire tracks. Secondly, because the car's engine and exhaust system were so loud that both my handlers and my suspects would have heard it. I knew that my observers, who check on me every hour or so at random intervals, would not come while I was gone. Andy Taylor was one of the people I helped through his divorce, and he didn't know what I was going to do, but he would make sure he didn't come until I got back. Starting the recording, which was made at 7 p.m. 4 nights ago, I opened the window at the back of the house I was using for shelter and climbed over the rope I had installed specifically for this purpose to the next building. I also didn't want extra footprints to alert the investigator to my absence. Once I was on the ground, I got into my rental car and drove the 3 miles to my vantage point above Meg's mission. I fired up my digital camera and started recording video of Meg, and that bastard Ray then set up my Browning rifle. I looked through the scope and discovered that they had started without me. I had the Browning rifle in sight, it was so easy, but I didn't want to kill anyone. I shot, but not to kill anyone. I calmly picked up the Browning rifle and returned to the rental car. I drove for miles, cut through an alley, and ran the last block to the building next to my vantage point. I climbed over the rope again and returned to my observation house. I heard my voice on the recording continuing to make observations about what the subject was doing 4 nights ago. Between sentences, I turned off the recording and started talking about how the object was still lying there. I told a stupid joke that was so stupid that the guys listening to me had to laugh, although I couldn't hear their answer. "How do you get a nice 80-year-old woman to say the word damn?" I asked. "Make another 80-year-old woman yell bingo," I said and laughed. The guys who were watching me had a whole recording of the night's operation with my constant comments from 2 p.m. until the end of my shift at 10 p.m. It's not like anyone suspected me of shooting Ray. After all, we were friends and I had no known motive. Besides, no weapon was used. The Browning rifle I had gotten rid of could not be traced, and everyone knew that I loved Meg too much to risk accidentally hitting her. The last thing I needed to completely rule me out as a suspect was a clean polygraph. I knew how Arnie worked, and I knew that he would probably call me soon and ask someone to relieve me. He would then take me into a conference room that we sometimes use to interview important or famous witnesses and tell me what happened and ask if I knew anything about it. He will have our polygraph expert, Carter Hall, to evaluate my honesty and reactions. Carter uses one of the new machines that does not require a subject to be connected. They detect lies by analyzing the stress in the voice and the increase in heart rate. Carter, another colleague I helped, would guarantee me a clean test. And everything went pretty much as I expected, except that Arnie didn't take me out of surgery. He waited 2 hours until the end of my shift and even listened to some of my conversations. Almost according to the script, he called me into the interrogation room when I was being checked. His demeanor was informal, as if it was no big deal. "Dan," he said, "there's no need to worry, everything's fine." "Meg is fine," he said. I immediately jumped to my feet. I wasn't devoid of acting skills either. "What's wrong with Meg?" I almost screamed. "Relax, Dan," he said. "I told you she's fine." "But someone shot her and Ray while they were on a mission," he said. "Did Meg get shot?" I shouted. "No," he said sadly. "The bullet hit Ray." "You didn't know about this?" he asked. "Hell no," I screamed. "I was on a one-way call." "Someone should have come and told me," I said. Arnie left the room. I knew he would go talk to Carter. He returned a few minutes later and told me where I could find Meg. She was questioned about what happened, and her story had several discrepancies with what investigators found. I ran straight to the interrogation rooms. I looked through the glass and saw Frank Caspary talking to Meg. I waved at him, and he shook his head, telling me not to come in. I walked out and went back to Arnie. I knocked quietly on his door and entered. "Arnie, what the hell is going on?" I asked. "Meg is downstairs with Frank, and he wouldn't let me in." "You really need to learn better jokes," he said, motioning for me to sit down. "Dan, there's something strange going on here, and right now you're one of the few agents I have that I can truly trust," he said softly. "Earlier when we were talking, I asked Carter to check your answers using voice stress analysis," he said. "You spoke the truth," he said. "Your heart rate also showed that even though you were upset when I told you that Meg was at the scene, you were still telling the truth. Besides, I listened to almost 2 hours of your surveillance tape today, specifically between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., he said. Except for those stupid jokes, you were completely professional as usual, he continued. Then, with a grimace, he added, I think sitting there and watching some creep for 8 hours a day would make me want to laugh something too. But that wasn't enough. I asked psychologists to listen to your tape, and they cleared you too, he said. Your weapons, both your pistol and the sniper rifle you are taking with you, have not been used and are of the wrong caliber, he said. I started to say something, but he raised his hand to stop me. The guys from the inspection team reported that at 7:30 p.m., just 2 minutes before the incident, you were still in the observation hut, he said. I sent an incident team to inspect your place as well, he continued. There was only one pair of tire tracks going in and out, he said. Your car never left the cabin, he added. There were also just your footprints going in and out once, and the footprints of your handlers in the area, he said. Why are you testing me? I asked. You really have no idea what's going on, do you? He asked. I would know if someone just fucking told me something, I exploded. I told you yesterday about Meg and Ray's sloppy surveillance, he began. I also said that I would wait until the end of the mission to decide what to do, he continued. They were at work again tonight, and at approximately 7:32 p.m. They were shot at by unknown assailants, he said. The shooter was in all likelihood either extremely lucky or extremely skilled, he continued. But you said Meg wasn't hurt, I shouted. I saw her, she's fine. She was not injured during the shooting, he said. Then how did she get hurt? I asked. I just sat there as if I was on the verge of an emotional collapse. In fact, I was cold and calculating and laughed to myself. Listen, Dan, we've known each other a long time, and I promise to look into this matter. Just go home. It's going to be a long night, he said. After questioning Meg, I'll have to talk to her for a while, and I think you and her will have to talk to her for a long time when she gets home, he said. Perhaps you shouldn't both work for the same agency, he said. I'll stay and wait for Meg, I said stubbornly. Listen, Dan, I'm ordering you to go home and wait for her, he said. I'll have her call you and let you know when she's leaving, he said. Have him call me when he's finished and leaves the building, I said. So I can get up and wait for her, I said. I'll try to get some sleep. I have a morning shift tomorrow. Think you'd like to take a few days off? Arnie asked. No, why do I need this? I asked in response. Well, if you change your mind, let me know, he said. After I left Arnie's office, I called to leave a message for Bonnie to call me at her convenience. To my surprise, she was still in her office. Hi, Bonnie, this is Dan Almond, I said. Hi, Dan, she said. Her voice had that husky, smoky edge that I've always found incredibly sexy in a woman. I didn't expect you to be there. I was just going to leave you a message, I said. Well, when it comes to your papers, when you use irreconcilable differences as a reason for divorce, it's probably the easiest thing in the world, she said. There is nothing to prove on both sides. In your case, there are no children. You have already divided the finances, and you are stating that she will give the house, so it is a done deal. I can serve her the summons tomorrow, she said. I can also bring the other party to trial for alienation of affection if necessary, she said. Okay, how did you know? I asked. You and I have crossed paths in court several times, she said. You always check your affairs very carefully, she continued. So I know enough about you to know that you love your wife and have probably never cheated on her, she continued. Other lawyers I talked to have told me that your wife is much less scrupulous in court and with the law, so I just assumed that if anyone was breaking the rules, it was probably her, she said. Thanks, Bonnie, I said and hung up after giving her Meg's office address and number. I got into my Mustang and drove around town, listening to what is now called the radio and wondering where the hell my life had gone wrong. Less than a week ago, I was probably the happiest person on the planet. I had everything planned, a career I loved, a woman who loved me, and everything was perfect. Now I'm sinking into depression. I don't know who to trust, especially not Meg. I broke the law and almost killed a fellow agent, and I'm getting a divorce soon. I don't know what to expect tomorrow or even tonight, let alone the rest of my life. To tell you the truth, I've been thinking a lot about Meg and the way she handles things, especially how many partners she's had in the last year. She seems to go through them pretty quickly. Maybe they pass through it just as quickly. So I really don't know how many of the men I was counting on have already had an affair with my wife. Chances are, Ray probably wasn't the first. Damn, how much ammo do I need? After some time on the road, I realized I hadn't eaten, so I started looking for something open. I saw another Mustang parked at an old-fashioned hot dog place. It must be some kind of sign, so I parked nearby and went inside. There was a fat and sloppy night cook sitting at an even fatter counter and a lone customer at a table away from the windows. 2 hot dogs with everything and add some pickles, I said, sitting down next to another customer, to go. The cucumbers add flavor, I said in response to his curious look. What year? He asked. '08 charcoal GT, I said. '06 flashy yellow GT, he replied. I like your paint, I said. Sometimes I wish I had yours, he said. There are times when you really want to be inconspicuous, and a bright yellow Mustang is pretty hard to hide. Hide sounds like a good idea right now, I said. You can't escape this, he began. It's like our cars. How so? I asked when the cook brought me the package. Look at the front of the horse, the running pony, he said. This horse is a purely American symbol. It means freedom, he continued. But if you look at a horse, it doesn't run away from something, he said, looking at me. This horse is running right into the thick of things and people like us, he said. So whoever they are, and he paused, be that Mustang, run straight at them and show them where the crayfish spend the winter. I think my back was a little straighter than it was when I walked in, and I turned the engine a little louder than necessary as I pulled out of the parking lot. Fuck this pathetic behavior. I went home. Meg. After my interrogation, I was told to go to Arnie's office immediately. He actually scolded me and made it clear that there would be a very thorough investigation both internally and externally. He has already cleared several agents in the unit, including Dan, but will question everyone. He told me that he talked to some of my ex-partners, and they were acting strange after they found out about Ray. Did I know anything about this? He asked me if I wanted to tell him something and then told me not to answer. He told me to take the rest of the night and morning and report to him tomorrow afternoon. Then he will have preliminary conclusions and a report from the group on site, and we will have a serious conversation. If I had some things he needed to know and he got them through my confession or statement, it would be better for me in the long run. So he was giving me time to go home and talk to Dan and decide what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be when this was all over. He also told me that Dan wanted me to call him on the way home after I left the building. Hearing that Dan wanted to talk to me was the best news I'd had all day. My mind was racing. What did Dan know? Who was he talking to? How much should I tell him? If all this becomes known, no one will be able to understand it, especially Dan. I had a little over 12 hours to figure out a way out of this. Realistically speaking, there was no way out. It seemed like the best solution would be to go and admit what Ray and I were doing, ask Arnie to let me quit, and, for the sake of all the years we've known each other and worked together, please not involve Ray's wife or Dan. If I had to sacrifice my career or my marriage, there was no choice. Dan and I could start having children. I would miss the excitement and feeling of serving my country, but I could never give up on Dan. I started to feel warm and cozy thinking about it. I could see myself as big as a damn whale, my belly bloated from carrying a miniature version of me and Dan together. It would be heaven. I called him on his cell phone as I pulled out of the garage. He actually answered this time. Dan, honey, I'm on my way, I said, already anticipating how he would hug me again. He had a way of just making everything good. We need to talk about our future and my job, I said. We have nothing to talk about, he said coldly. Dan, I don't want to quit my job, I said, but maybe it's time for us to look to the future. That's not what I meant, he said. I don't remember his voice being so lifeless. I know you're mad at me, honey, But there are things you don't know, I said. We'll talk about this when I get home. Meg, don't come here, he said. Go to Mom, sit down, go to the motel, sleep in the car, I don't care. This is not your home anymore, we have no future, and I don't care about your damn job, he snapped. Meg, I know a lot more about this than you think, and there's nothing more we can talk about, he said and hung up. In Arnie's office, I was focused and calm, thinking through my options like I had been taught. But when Dan hung up the phone, everything changed, and I just couldn't play the game anymore. I started crying like a little girl. Don't sob and hang your head, with tears running down your cheeks like an adult woman, but simply cry like a preschool girl. After driving around the city for about 30 minutes, I checked into one of the cheap motels near the airport. I took off my clothes and went to bed. My cell phone rang, and I looked at the screen and answered immediately when I saw it was Dan. Dan, I said. I was sure he was ready to tell me to come home. Look, Meg, I tried to be fair in everything I did, he said. And I realized that asking you not to come home on such short notice was unfair. I'll leave early in the morning, probably before you wake up, he said. Why don't you come home in the morning, he began. And we can talk, I started before he interrupted me. No, Meg, he said. I don't want to talk to you for now, maybe ever. I just wanted to give you a chance to get some personal items from the house, he said. So you can come tomorrow and I'll stay somewhere else tomorrow night, he said. That way, you'll have more than enough time to pack your things. Dan, fuck these things, I said. I love you, Dan. The most valuable thing I have is you. You don't have me anymore, Meg, he said. You left me for Ray, and who else were you with? My heart stopped when I realized that he knew. Now it wasn't about keeping my job or keeping him from finding out about my extracurricular activities. Dan knew, and I fought for my life because I was sure I would slowly die without him. Not only did he know, but he had time to think about it and decide that our marriage was not worth saving. I just stared at the ceiling, wondering why I was so stupid. I had everything and I ruined everything. I had to find a way to get him to take me back, no matter what. But Dan, I started, but realized I was speaking into the phone because Dan had hung up. The next morning, or rather the next afternoon, I woke up and checked out of the motel. I could always return or find another, but today, and hopefully for the rest of my life, I will return to my home. I got dressed and got into the car. It's amazing how the individual mind works. I felt dirty and cheap because I was wearing the same clothes and underwear as yesterday, but I cheated on my husband for months and didn't feel bad until he found out. I still didn't consider it a complete betrayal. And secondly, because all this was done only to film my nervous tension. I needed to explain this to Dan because I was sure from what he said on the phone last night, he thought I had slept with other men. It has never been and will never be like this. I parked in our driveway, my mind filled with different thoughts at once. Pain, anger, sadness, regret, everything was mixed up in my head at that moment. I had so many good memories of this house. Why does he think I'll just give it up? I entered the house and walked around it, looking at everything as if I was seeing it for the first time, or maybe the last time. I climbed upstairs and plopped down on our bed, glad that it still smelled like Dan. I wrapped myself in a blanket and enjoyed this feeling. I know I probably looked stupid rolling around on the bed, wrapped in the covers like a living burrito, but I was warm and surrounded by Dan's scent. It was almost as if I hadn't ruined our marriage. But I destroyed it, and for what? For mediocre foreplay to relieve nervous tension. If I gave myself a chance to adjust, I would get used to it like everyone else. And it was mostly those guys' fault, because they were doing it for sex, and they were married too. At least it helped me function better at work. I'm not saying I was a victim, but it wasn't entirely my fault. I needed to explain all this to Dan. I was sure that once he knew all the facts, he would still be angry with me, but he would be able to forgive me. He would have to, because if I was sure of anything in life, it was that Dan loved me as much as I loved him. I got out of the blanket and folded it carefully. I was going to take it with me when I left, because if we were apart for any time, I would need it. I took off my clothes and went to the bathroom, remembering all the effort we had put into finding wallpaper and tiles for this room. Dan was really upset about the cost of these tiles until we took our first bath together in this huge tub. I started crying again, realizing that the little things I had taken for granted were now things I would have to fight to keep. I think it's the little things that are really special. It's the little everyday things that frame our lives and create our most powerful memories. I looked in the full-length mirror while I dried myself. I put on one of Dan's thick robes, which again had his scent, and went downstairs to the kitchen. As I approached the kitchen, I smelled coffee, my favorite French roast brand, and the tears started flowing again. Dan hated my coffee, but he turned on the coffee maker and left it on a very low temperature to keep the coffee warm for me. There was a caramel pecan bagel and a note on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. I took the note with some trepidation, remembering the coldness of our last conversation. Meg, I'm so sorry it ended this way, and I would have given anything for it not to have happened. For as long as I can remember, you have been the most important part of my life, and losing you is a blow that will take me a long time to recover from. My sincerest intention was to spend my whole life with you, and maybe one day with our children, but alas, that will never happen, so all I ask is that we handle this with professionalism and dignity and not give in to anger, pain, and other negative emotions. In this spirit, I have decided to give you time to gather the necessary things. Please try to show me the same courtesy as I tried to show you. Please take back everything that belongs to you, whether it was purchased by you yourself, or jointly by both of us, or by me as a gift to you. Please don't take or damage my things. Please also make a list of the things we shared that you would like to keep. I'll mark the ones I don't need, and maybe we can agree on the rest. My intention is to keep the house. I believe that this is fair as the injured party. I have the right to this. If in time the house becomes too big and empty for me, I will give you the opportunity to have it. If you also don't want the house at that moment, we can put it up for sale and split the proceeds. I don't think there's much more to say except that we're both suffering now, at least I am, and I'm guessing you're suffering a little too. But since I've probably never known you, I could be wrong. I don't hold it against you, and I hope you find someone who makes you as happy as you've made me for so many years. Daniel Almond. When I finished reading the note, I was overcome with despair. I had about 3 hours before my meeting with Arnie, and I didn't know what to do or what to tell him. Should I even go? Ultimately, I don't really care about work anymore. Okay, Arnie, I'm not the best agent. So what? I haven't done anything criminal, so the worst thing they can do is fire me. Again, so what? The most important thing for me right now is to talk to Dan. He really doesn't understand what was happening or why. He also doesn't know that there were others besides Ray. When he finds out, or if he finds out, it could make the situation even worse. I was selfish, that's obvious. I had a man who loved me so much that I still feel it today, and all he expected of me was to love him just as much in return. I never thought how much it could hurt him. I prayed it wasn't too late. My phone rang, it was the hospital. Ray woke up and wanted to see me. Dan. I worked my morning surveillance shift with a partner this time. One of our informants reported that a new deal for my boyfriend might be on the way, so we needed to keep him under surveillance and have enough presence to cover any possible situations. My partner was temporary and a recent transfer from another branch in another state. This was good because it meant I only had to worry about his competence if things got hot. I didn't have to worry about whether he slept with my wife. Action, I said into the microphone. There's another car in place. The visitor appears to be a woman, I continued, relaying every detail I could see. Sometimes the little things matter. The woman was allowed into the house by the suspect himself. I moved to my sniper rifle and pointed the scope through the front windows of the house. I saw the suspect talking to a woman. She led most of the conversation. She handed him the paper, and he nodded several times. He put the note on the table. She then hugged him, and they went into the back room where they were out of sight. I quickly jumped up, grabbed my cell phone and digital camera. "Charles, I'm going down. Give the signal if they come back," I said. My new partner looked shady because if I were caught it could jeopardize the operation and I could be captured, injured, or killed. But like most good agents, he immediately assessed the risks and simply nodded. I crept down the hill, keeping an eye on the door through which they had entered. I used everything I could for cover and finally hid behind the woman's car. Then I crouched under the window and looked inside. I clearly saw the paper, but even from such a distance, I could not make out what was written on it. I pointed the camera lens at the paper and took pictures at different magnifications and angles. I heard something knocking and moaning from the back room. Great, I thought. Everyone around here is having sex, except me. I carefully tried the door, and luck smiled at me. It opened, so I listened closely. They were still doing their thing. I went inside and quickly walked up to the desk, took 3 good pictures of the front and back of the paper, and then walked out. Unfortunately, as I was closing the door, they started opening another door. I knew that if I tried to run away, they would see me. I quickly removed the memory card from the camera and threw the camera down the hill as far as possible. Then I knocked on the door. A few minutes later, my boyfriend came to the door. He barely opened the door, and I was sure that he was holding a weapon behind it. "Hey, man," I said, sounding a little drunk. "My car died up there on the road," I said, pointing in the direction I came from. "Can I use your phone? You're the only house here for miles," I mumbled. "I don't have a phone, man," he said sharply in a thick accent. "So get out of here before things get real," he continued. I stepped back and pretended to almost fall off the porch and then walked in the wrong direction. "Hey, dumbass," he shouted. "You're going the wrong way." I fell and sat on my butt, looking at him puzzled. "Where should I go?" I asked, my face a mask of confusion. "That way," he said, pointing up the slope. "Oh yeah, thanks, man," I muttered and began to hobble up the hill. When I was out of their sight, I quickly changed direction and walked back to the house where I came from. I got to the cabin just in time to see a car drive up to the front. 2 other agents jumped out of the car. "Dan, are you crazy?" asked Andy Taylor. Andy was one of my best friends, my usual partner, and the one who had my back the night I shot Ray. "I needed to get pictures of this paper," I said. "She's probably important." "Was it worth your life?" he asked. "These guys are not nice." "Besides, it was all in vain. You had to throw away the camera," he said. "But not the important part," I said, taking the memory card out of my pocket. "Holy shit," he said. "You need to get this to base immediately. We'll relieve you early. Tell Arnie to update the schedule for the next team," he said. "I don't want to miss my date tonight by staying here longer than necessary," he continued. "And Dan," he said more quietly, "we need to talk later because you're acting like I was when I was going through this. She's not worth your life." I returned to the office and handed the memory card to Arnie. He inserted it into the card reader on his computer. When he looked at the pictures, he frowned because the ones I took from a distance were unreadable. "Maybe techies can improve them," he said. "Scroll to the last 6, I replied. "Damn, you're great," he said. "How did you get these pictures?" he asked. "They look as if they were made from inside the room," he exclaimed. "It is," I said. Arnie, as I said, was my friend. He looked at me as if appraising me. "Dan, we both know there's something going on here. There's an elephant in the room that we're both uncomfortable talking about," he said softly. "I don't have all the facts, but I know Meg is involved, and I'm pretty sure how," he said. "I also know that you probably know something too, and it's killing you," he said. "But don't start taking unnecessary risks because you're going through something terrible," he continued. "We have a difficult job. More than half of my agents, even those who are not married to someone in the service, are divorced," he continued. "Hell, I've been married and divorced 3 times," he said. "But I can't afford to lose you as an asset or as a friend," he said. "So, should I sit you at the table until this passes?" he asked. "Or will you handle it?" he asked. "No unnecessary risks," I said. "I'll call you when we've analyzed the information from the photos," he said. "Good job." I went to the shooting range and spent an hour practicing. It also helped me blow off steam and relax. Doing it here was the only option since I gave Meg access to the house for the day. After the shooting range, I went to the gym and started doing strength training. For the first 20 minutes, I was alone. Then I heard a voice behind me. "I heard you're some kind of super spy now," she said. I turned around to see Kelly Tamashita standing behind me in what looked like a tight workout outfit. I saw her in the building for several years. She was hard to miss. But I was always so in love with Meg that I never paid attention to other women. "No, just doing my job," I replied. I really had to make an effort to look at her face and not at her cleavage and breasts. She smiled, noticing my desire not to take my eyes off her face. "I'm used to having a private workout here at lunchtime," she said. "So I dress for comfort," she continued. "Or at least as comfortable as I can be in a public place," she added, leaving the air filled with all sorts of innuendo. "Well, this is my last episode," I said. "So soon you'll have privacy again." "Well, I'm getting used to the idea of having a training partner," she said. "Besides, I have an idea," she continued. I tilted my head slightly to indicate that I wanted to hear her idea, and she continued. "Field agents get better training when it comes to self-defense and things like that," she said. This was the first time I heard someone say etc. in a sentence, and it made me smile. I hadn't smiled since I found out about Meg, so it made me feel better, and some of the tension I was carrying around with me dissipated. "So what about this? To have a match," she said, pointing to the rubber surface of the sparring area. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered someone saying something about Kelly having a black belt in some form of martial art. I also remembered that she liked to humiliate field agents by defeating them in impromptu sparring matches. "Okay," I heard myself reply, and then added, "Don't be too hard on me." "I hope you will become cruel to me," she answered with a smile. That was a strange remark, I thought. I wonder what she meant. We got into a fighting stance on the carpet, and before I could say anything. I'm still married, I thought, so I shouldn't do this. On the other hand, Meg clearly wasn't thinking about me, so why should I doubt it? She leaned over me. "We can't do this," I said. "I'm married. If half the rumors around here are true, you won't be around much longer," she hissed. "You're not the kind of person who tolerates cheating," she said. "Especially when you can have someone who will be faithful to you," she continued. I felt like I was in a movie, and once I decided to go for it, the movie changed. Suddenly, I felt like I was in a remake of Aliens when I heard Meg's voice booming from above and behind us. "Get away from him, bitch," she screamed. She then grabbed Kelly by the waist and pulled her off me. Kelly quickly stood up and took a fighting stance against Meg, who clearly had no intention of backing down. I grabbed Meg by the waist and pulled her away. "Maybe I'll see you later, Kelly," I said. "Not very likely if I say anything," Meg hissed. Kelly smiled and said, "I'll mail you my phone number," as she left the gym. Meg. Ray's hospital room looked like every other hospital room I had seen over the years. Some antiseptic mixture of gray and light blue designed to make her happy, which only makes her even darker. They might as well try putting baby elephant stickers on the walls because they wouldn't be able to do it anyway. No matter how cheerful the paint or decorations were, it would be almost impossible to lighten the mood because the people in the hospital are there because they are sick or there is something wrong with them. In most cases, the only thing that makes them happy is the news that they are going home. I saw Ray's wife as I quietly closed the door behind me. Suddenly, I realized that I couldn't remember her name. Why should I remember her name? She is his wife, not mine. I didn't want to be there at all. I should have dealt with my own problems and not come to hold the hand of a grown man. He had a lot of nerve to call me here like that. I already practically saved his life. What more did he want from me? It wasn't me who shot him, and I had nothing to do with it. His voice sounded like he was heavily pumped up on painkillers as he asked Baby to give us a minute. "It's for work. You know I can't discuss it with you in the room," he said. "Don't worry, I'll give it back to you in a minute," I said, handing her the flowers I bought from the gift shop downstairs. I stumbled again, trying to remember her name, and almost called her baby myself. So much for a compassionate partner trying to ease his wife's pain. I just wasn't very good at it. But one thing I learned was that she either didn't know about Ray and me, or she was fine with it. I knew this because if she knew and she wasn't okay with it, she would be upset and I would have to knock her down. I smiled again and waved as she closed the door. As soon as I heard the door lock click, I turned to Ray and my face changed. "Why the hell did you call me here?" I asked sharply. "I have a business." "I have a meeting with Arnie in an hour and a half," I said. "And Dan knows about us," I continued. "So I'm going to have to do a lot to try to save my marriage. So as much as I feel sorry for you, I have more important priorities," I said. Ray's eyes narrowed, and the screen monitoring his heartbeat sped up. "You're a really cold bitch," he said. "I only called you here to ask you one question," he continued. "Besides, I called you to help you," he continued. Almost everyone from the department had already come, either while I was still unconscious or after. "So it seems really suspicious that my partner is one of the few who didn't show up," he said. "Do you think Dan shot me?" he asked. "Why are you even asking me this question?" I snapped. "I've been thinking about this a lot since I woke up," he said. "When the ballistics came, they shouldn't have, but they told me a few things," he said. "Because of the penetration of the bullet into the wall after it hit me and the caliber, they think the bullet was fired over a quarter of a mile away," he said. "There are only 2 guys in our unit who could make a shot like that, and the ballisticians don't even know that the shot was harder than they think," he said. "Why was it more difficult?" I asked. "Because whoever it was, he shot at me and did it without hitting you," he said. "Once again, the only guys in our unit who could have made a shot like that were Arnie when he was at his best, but he's no longer in shape, and your husband Dan. When they found out about me, all your old partners started acting strange," he continued. "I don't think any of them want to go against your husband," he said. "He's been acting strange lately. Anything that would give you clues about what he knew before?" he asked. "Damn," I said. "The night before yesterday I came home, and not only did he not call me, but he was not waiting for me. He also didn't wake up to have sex with me and slept on the furthest side of the bed," I said. "I just thought he was tired," I continued. "But the next morning he got up and left without saying a word. I tried calling him all day, but he didn't pick up," I said. "But it couldn't have been him who shot you because he was on a mission, and they have continuous recording of him talking throughout our operation and the trip to the hospital," I said. "There's no way, even for Dan, to be in 2 places at once," I said. "He also took a lie detector test and a vocal stress test," I said. "He didn't even know you got shot before everyone else found out because he was in the field," I said. "Besides, if it had been him, he probably would have shot both of us," I said sadly. "I think I'd rather he shoot us both, because if I don't find a way to get him back, I'll probably die anyway," I said. "I'd rather have a quick, clean bullet than have to fight and watch him without being able to touch him or talk to him," I said. "And the worst part would be if I had to watch him start dating someone else. It would be a slow, painful death," I said. "Something like me," Ray said. "I may never have children," he said. "And even if Betty doesn't find out about us, she probably will when the crime scene report comes out." "Why will she stay with me if we can't have sex?" he said. "I also talked to Arnie," he began. "No matter how this ends, I think I'm going to have a desk job or something worse." "And you have problems too," he said. "Besides, to ask you if your husband shot me, I wanted to warn you," he said. "Though after talking to you, I'm starting to wonder why," he said. "I told Arnie to throw you back into the field as quickly as possible so you wouldn't be scared by my failure," he said. "Well, you know they won't send a woman out into the field alone," he began, "and no one wants to work with you." "What?" I screamed. "Almost every one of your former teammates has applied for a transfer," he said. "This looks really bad. And I think even people you haven't worked with don't want to work with you," he said. "Bad news travels fast." To be honest, I already told you that I heard rumors about you before we were assigned to work together, he said. And I think our recent string of failures hasn't helped your career at all. Perhaps that's how Dan found out about us, and you know how men exaggerate, he said. That's why Dan thinks you and I slept together, I screamed. Ray, I know you don't owe me anything except to save your life, I said. But if I bring Dan here, will you tell him the truth about what we did and why? I begged him. Ray nodded slowly. It's all yours, Betty, I said joyfully as I left the room. He'll do great, I added. In the elevator on the way down, I again wondered whether I should even go to meet Arnie. Maybe I should just type up my resignation letter and submit it. My priorities right now should have been saving my marriage, then saving my job, then Ray and his career and marriage. If I have to leave Ray to his fate to save my marriage, then so be it. When I arrived at the office after going through security, I ran into Maxine Penn. Maxine was an old friend of mine who I went through the academy with. Unfortunately, she couldn't stand field work, so she was an analyst. Maxine was usually the most cheerful person you could meet, but this time she couldn't meet my eyes. Max, what happened? I asked. I've heard a lot of bad things about you lately, Meg, she said. But you should check out the gym before it's too late, she continued. What are you talking about? I asked, looking at Maxine's retreating back. I thought it was probably something stupid, like someone had written, for a good time called Meg on the wall. But even if it was something stupid like that, I didn't want Dan to see it and think it was worse than it was. At this point, I was confident that I could explain the truth to Dan, that I had never had sex with anyone but him since we met, so it wasn't as bad as he thought, and it really wasn't cheating. And I was sure, especially after the note he left me and everything else he did, that he still loved me enough to forgive me once, even though it might take a while. I was ready to do literally anything to get him back. I went to the gym and opened the door to find myself in shock and pain. It was like someone punched me in the stomach multiple times and I couldn't breathe. It seemed like there was a red veil before my eyes when I saw that bitch Kelly with my husband. Get away from him, bitch, I screamed, dragging her off him. I felt Dan pull me away from her, telling her that maybe he would see her later. I was so angry. Not very likely if I decide anything, I growled through clenched teeth. And believe it or not, this bitch just smiled and said she would mail him her phone number. I wanted to run after her and beat her up, but Dan wouldn't let me. Dan, I said, I love you and only you. Can't we talk about it? We have nothing to talk about, Meg, he said. When he said this, he brushed the hair out of my eyes with his hands and held my face. I loved it when he did this. Even now, one touch from him began to restore order in my head. Sorry, he said. An old habit won't happen again. But I want it to happen again, I said, sobbing. Dan, you don't understand. I never slept with any of them, I said. There was more than just Ray, he asked. Yes, but that was only because I needed to relieve the excess adrenaline when I was on a mission, I said. It wasn't real cheating, I said, realizing how stupid it sounded. Meg, how did you feel when you walked into the gym and saw me on the floor with Kelly? He asked. I felt terrible. I was so full of rage and wanted to kill her, I said honestly. Meg, we both had our clothes on. It was just a sparring match that got out of hand and there was no contact, he said. So now imagine how you would feel if you walked in and saw what you and your partner were doing in the car, he said. I would kill her, I said, really and slowly. So that would be treason, he asked. But this is different, I sobbed. Maybe the reason could be different, but the feeling would be the same, he said. When we got married, it was with the understanding that we would be faithful to each other until death do us part, he said. It was a big commitment for me, he said, and no matter how much you tried to justify it, you broke it. Now that I know your reasons, I can partly understand how you could consider this acceptable to you, he said. But for me, it's just not acceptable because I don't want to be one of the 6 or 7 guys you have sex with, he said. So let's get to the point. For the sake of the 10 wonderful years we spent together, I forgive you, he said, looking at his watch. "Aren't you late for your meeting with Arnie?" he added. "Oh, yes," I said. "I almost forgot. Can we finish this later?" He sighed and nodded his head. "I'll go into the house," he said. I ran up the stairs with my heart lighter than it had been in days. Dan forgave me, and that was all that mattered. I walked into Arnie's office without even knocking. He looked at me as if he wanted to reproach me for being rude, but I just didn't care. "Speak," I said with a smile. He looked at me strangely and tilted his head. "Meg, I'm sorry to tell you this, but after careful investigation and speaking with several former partners, I have a pretty good idea of what was going on," he said. "I need my men in the field with excellent judgment and strong morale," he said. "I've had to sternly reprimand and transfer every agent you've worked with over the last year," he said. "I also have to worry about the state of mind of your husband, who is my best agent," he said. Noticing me surprised expression on his face, he asked, "You didn't know?" Dan took a risk this morning that could have easily cost him his life. I hope he can regain his good judgment, but if he can't, I'll have to put him behind the table, he said. But in your case, as short as I am in reliable field agents, largely because of you, he said, I simply don't need a command lecture. So in the interests of national security, you're fired, he said coldly. Put your things away immediately. Security personnel are waiting for you in your office and will escort you out of the building, he said. Is there anything you want to say about this? He asked. Are there any reasons to reverse this decision? He looked like he really hoped I would come up with something. No, screw it all, see you, I said almost happily and left his office, leaving him looking at me in shock. When I reached my office, there was an official little man waiting for me. Meg Almond, he asked. Yes, I answered. They'll give it to you, he said, handing me a thick envelope and leaving. I opened the envelope and started reading the documents. There must be some mistake, I said. Dan has forgiven me. Dan has forgiven me, I continued to scream as I ran down the stairs. The guards started following me. I ran into the dining room and saw Kelly approaching Dan. She pulled a chair over to his desk and sat down, smiling at him. Dan has forgiven me, I screamed. Isn't that right, Dan? Yes, he said. I have forgiven you. Then why did this little man give me divorce papers? I asked. And why are all my ex-partners listed in them? It will cause divorces for them too, I said. It's not fair, Dan, that we get back together and they all end up divorced, I said. We're not getting back together, Meg, Dan said slowly. He couldn't see Kelly smiling at me behind his back. I said I forgive you, but that doesn't mean I could live with what you did, he said. It also doesn't mean I could ever forget or even get over it, he continued. And it especially doesn't mean I could ever trust you again, and without trust, there's no point in being in a marriage, he said. We just need to move forward with our lives, and who knows, maybe when the pain and wounds heal, we can become friends, he said. Friends, I thought. I don't want to be his damn girlfriend. My heart beats only in response to him. I know I made a big mistake, but that doesn't mean I have to lose everything. My job, my reputation, my marriage, my husband, my lover, my best friend, I'm losing everything. Arnie said he doesn't have enough agents. He'll probably reassign that bitch Kelly to field duty temporarily. Then she'll get everything I'm losing. She's already after Dan. The ink wasn't even dry on our damn divorce papers yet, and she was already clinging to him. No damn chance, I thought. I collapsed as if about to cry, and then, as quickly as possible, I grabbed one of the guard's guns from his holster. When they started to retreat, trying to figure out what I would do, I fired twice. I killed Kelly and myself. We'll end our fight in hell, bitch, I thought.